and welcome to this podcast from Pharmaron's DMPK Insight series. This one's entitled, It's All Go with Oligos, Challenges and Opportunities in LC-MS of Therapeutic Oligonucleotides. I'm Robert MacNeill, Director of Bioanalysis at Pharmaron's Exton, Pennsylvania site in the United States. I'm honored to be joined today by Professor Michael Bartlett from the University of Georgia, whose research group over the years has produced a plethora of bioanalytical LC-MS research, and who recently have become synonymous with high-profile oligonucleotide methodological innovation. Indeed, there have been almost 200 peer-reviewed publications produced by Bartlett's research. Additionally, we have a former member of the Bartlett group, Guilherme Guimaraes, who now works at Biogen in Boston. Gui, as he likes to be known, is a rising star of the oligo LC-MS world, as shown in some recent cutting-edge publications. And as I like to say, when the going gets tough, the tough get gooeying. And Gui really is a giant in the domain already. So gentlemen, I guess we can get started with the subject matter. And of course, I promised not to make any jokes about making sense or anti-sense in conversation. So collectively, we three are rather interested in alternative approaches to bioanalytical LC-MS of oligonucleotides. Can we begin by maybe elaborating on the possible reasons why ion pairing reversed phase became the historical default, if you will?
Well, I think if you were to look at the origins of chromatographic analysis of oligos, it really all started with reverse phase separations using ammonium acetate. So I don't think it's really surprising that since this was such a popular mobile phase, for LC-MS due to its volatility, that people decided to use it to look at oligos as well. There was also not a surprising move then to start with ion pairing using triethyl ammonium acetate as well, because that had been used pretty successfully with peptides as well. And so I think it was a pretty logical move early on to go to that. So I think the real problem at that point is that we were struggling with poor sensitivity. We didn't really know why we had it. But I think, at this point, we've recognized that acetate is a major contributor to poor sensitivity in LC-MS using ion pair or reverse phase analysis of oligos. And we were able to finally break free from that when we replaced acetate with hexafluoroisopropanol or HFIP. And I think that really sort of got the field moving forward again. And you've started to see people then, trying to optimize the ion pairing by playing with the different alkylamines and the different fluoroalcohols at that point. But I think, the big changes that have occurred more recently really is just because a lot more people have come into the field. Oligos have become a lot more popular as therapeutics. And with more people in the field, people have been willing to try different things. And so you're starting to see a rise in people trying new things like Hillock now.
Was there a problem as well with attaining decent retention with just the likes of ammonium acetate? In that, was it easier to finally, fulfill chromatographic specifications once the real ion pairing was introduced?
I mean, I think the issue with ammonium acetate was just it didn't interface with mass spectrometry as well as people had hoped for. The retention was okay, but still not as great as you'd hope for as well. So there were multiple problems with it, and so the ion pairing helped a lot more with the retention and the separation of it. But again, the mass spec sensitivity was still fairly poor as well. Though the ion pairing acetate separations themselves with a UV detector are actually pretty solid. So that part of it wasn't a big issue. It was the move to wanting to use mass spectrometry so that you could figure out more of what you were looking at than what you got with just using a UV detector.
Right. Sorry, Gary, I cut you off earlier.
No problem. And I think just the use of ion pairs in general just paired well with what the field started to require in terms of, the emergence of these oligos as therapeutics. And now you need chromatographic selectivity, and you also need higher sensitivity to be able to detect some of these either low impurities or whatever metabolites you may be having. So you get both, if you could get both the selectivity as well as chromatographic selectivity and sensitivity on the mass spec, and it just paired very well with what was needed from these methods. And so I think it kind of like the popularity just increased even more.
Yeah, cool. And the same note, what advantages do the likes of Hillock or any other normal phase alternative hold for the area?
Yeah, I think it's been surprising actually how long it took people to really start looking at Hillock. But I mean, there were some obvious reasons to think that it was going to be successful. It improves the retention of polar analytes. And when you're looking at all the major classes of biomolecules, there are no molecules more polar than oligonucleotides. And we would expect it to improve desolvation and electrospray because you have such high organic content in the mobile phase. So I think Hillock holds a lot of key advantages. The most obvious one, of course, is not needing the ion pairing agents in your mobile phase, since that makes it difficult to use LCMS for the analysis of non-nucleic acids without having to dedicate a significant amount of effort to cleaning out your system. And obviously that's going to impact throughput of samples on your LCMS system. So I think some of the other advantages, though, is that it also provides a different retention mechanism. And so it could be beneficial to helping you separate analytes that have been problematic when using ion pair reverse phase chromatography, just because you'll get different selectivity with Hillock than you'll get with ion pair reverse phase.
I like the fact also that it seems entirely intuitive, if that's the word. There's not much out there that's more polar than oligonucleotides. And Hillock seems, from a superficial perspective, the best option to go with from the offset. Of course, the whole situation is more complex than that, but with that principle in place, it's attractive from that angle alone.
Yeah, and I mean, and not to mention too, from a DMPK perspective, if you're looking to outsource studies, depending on CROs that you're looking for, generally people tend to be a little more reluctant with ion pairing methods. It can be slightly harder to outsource. You have system contamination, right? Oftentimes, in our field, in bioanalytical, we care about robustness, we care about throughput. So we like to dedicate entire instruments only to ion pair use. And so, I don't know, Hillock kind of comes to solve a lot of these issues per se, if you can implement it in the right way. And in addition to that, with greener lab initiatives, we know that some of these ion pairs are toxic. There are pushes to ban some of these fluorinated reagents in Europe. So it would be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think we could expect tougher regulations on these mobile phases, these ion pair mobile phases, and with that, even higher costs. So that's another bigger thing, that some of these Hillock methods may be advantageous on that regard as well.
Right, and HFIP is expensive enough.
That is correct, and you need very high grades. It adds up, and the fact that you need to make mobile phases and you need to make them more often, that also, the bills start stack up for sure.
Yes, and with all the concerns that are primarily focused in Europe just now, like you alluded to, I think the whole dynamic is slowly changing. So even more focus on the likes of Hillock as a viable option.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one topic of discussion. We recently attended ASMS, and there was an interesting oligo workshop group discussion, and these were some of the main topics we discussed. Right, a lot of oligonucleotide manufacturing and as well as characterization is done in Europe, and so some of the groups were bringing their own perspective to the table, and what people are planning to do, and how they're just planning their workflows to the potential of either higher regulations or something along those lines.
Yeah, and that was the birthplace of #Hillock for that helix, right?
That's right.
I've heard it said that Hillock, if you were to scale it down to micro or nanoflow, doesn't have much chance of working. And I know you guys have done a bit of work in that particular domain. how might we increase sensitivity through scaling down in the manner suggested to micro or nanoflow LC? Can this be done with ion pairing reverse phase and Hillock and maintain practicality, ruggedness of performance, and reliability, do you think?
I mean, I think that's a fair question. We all recognize the advantages that come from doing lower flow rate, micro and nanoscale, both separations and electrospray, in particular, because again, you're going to get better efficiency in your chromatography, and in particular, you get smaller droplets in electrospray, so you get more surface area, so you get better ionization. So I think, the practical aspects are pretty attractive for us to try. But as you said, robustness is the issue of the day. But, we went through the same sort of growth pains as we tried to start shrinking HPLC columns, right? There was a time when people didn't believe 2 mm columns were robust enough to be used chromatographically, or even 1 mm columns. And I think as the manufacturing got better, we were able to overcome that as more people used them, became comfortable with them, and the volume of manufacturing of them increased. I think we're going to have to go through the same growth pains here as well. But I do certainly think that we'll gravitate to microflow LC pretty quickly. I think the robustness is going to be there at that level. I think nano LC, that's going to be tough. Mostly just because I think the run times are just going to be so extraordinarily long, and it's going to be too damaging to throughput for people to move to that very quickly. But again, I think a lot of this really is also going to come down to that we don't really understand the retention mechanisms in Hillock that well yet. I think we have a pretty good handle on the ion pair reverse phase retention mechanisms and the electrospray desorption mechanisms for it now, because we've had, a 10 to 20 year head start on people really thinking about it and studying it. And we're going to have to go through that with Hillock, I think, now too. In particular, because the retention mechanism for oligos in Hillock appears to be very different than traditional Hillock mechanisms as well. Because again, everybody believed it's that water layer in Hillock, that you have that partitioning into it, and it does not look like that's going to be a very significant part of the oligo retention mechanism, because again, we're using too much water in most of the Hillock methods to effectively have that water layer there as well. And so I think we're going to have to really work through that, because again, it looks like it's going to be much more of a hydrogen bonding and a little bit more of an ionic mechanism there. And I think we really need to understand that on the retention side, really, before we're going to make a lot more progress there.
Yeah, I've noticed that too, I must say, with the Hillock gradients that I've used in my groups personally, observing elution of the oligos at about 50% aqueous. So yeah, you have to think at that point, is it really classical Hillock as outlined years ago, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think it's something else entirely. I think it's a whole different type of retention than we have any other type of chromatography.
Yeah, so a lot of interesting research to come.
I'd just like to add, I think when you're looking at ion pairs, right, they get a lot of merit in their ability on their play in the chromatography side, but I don't think they get enough credit by how they help the desorption of the oligos in the ESI and the mass spec side of things, and how that improves your sensitivity. And so taking them away, as people are well aware, will take a toll on your sensitivity. But I've also observed, just from a quantitation perspective or a targeted quantitation perspective, is that in Hillock you also see the charge states change, right? You're working with higher charge states, and when you're developing some of these targeted methods, MSMS methods, and you're fragmenting these, they may not fragment as well as some of the lower charge states that you may get with ion pairs. And so it's almost like you're losing sensitivity twice, right? Two different factors, you're immediately affecting your sensitivity. And so, like you mentioned, a different chromatographic scale, it's advantageous to try to recover some of that sensitivity loss. And it's exciting to see the field adapting to it. There's some interesting hardwares coming out. We got to work with one of these where you're able to incorporate a multi-emitter and to your mass spec, with the idea being that you get microflow as well as nanoflow electrons, microflow LC, nanoflow electrospray and mass, to improve again an extra improvement of your sensitivity to try to recover some of that sensitivity loss. But I would say that, I have looked substantially into the options of Hillick columns in the microflow range. Not a ton of options, but I expect that to be changing soon. And as more and more research comes out, it will be interesting to see what kind of options would be out there for method development.
And tying into what you just said to some extent, when you mentioned the loss of sensitivity through difficult fragmentation, you start thinking about losing the tandem aspect and using high resolution to do, say, TOF-MS, and use that as your quantitative detection means. Which brings me to the next big question. What does the future hold, do you think, as regard the evolution of high-res mass spectrometry and the other popular alternative triple quadruples? How might selectivity and sensitivity compare?
Yeah, I think this is a big question in the field of mass spectrometry, and it's not just limited to oligonucleotides. But again, with oligos, there really are not a lot of direct head-to-head comparisons of the two approaches in the literature. But again, from what I've seen so far from looking at other types of molecules, it's actually a lot closer than I would have expected. I grew up as a triple quad quantitation person, and so it's almost heretical for me to even think that anything could be better than a triple quad for quantitation of molecules. But high resolution mass spectrometry does a pretty solid job of it. So again, I think it's going to be just like everything. It's going to be very dependent on your application. It's going to be very dependent on your molecule. And as Guy mentioned earlier, oligonucleotides are very complex fragmentation. And they fragment a lot more than biomolecules of other types of biomolecules that are the same size as these. And there are only a handful of high abundance fragments. They tend to be not very specific for your molecule. And so I think that's going to really open the door for high resolution approaches to looking at the intact molecules. Just because if you can't chromatographically resolve things, if you've got your mass window open and the fragments are all common, those are all problems that a triple quad is going to have a hard time with.
I think we're approaching an interesting era with triple quads, right? Is that we're obtaining so much sensitivity from these, and it's almost like, how much sensitivity do you need, right? And we keep pushing these limits, and so it'll be great to see some of the instruments with higher resolution. I know there's a bit of a trade-off between sensitivity there, but if sensitivity from these instruments would pick up a little more, like we are seeing new instruments coming in. I think that would be a huge help, right? Especially as if you're going towards the Hillick for oligos, you're sacrificing some of that selectivity on your chromatography. You could definitely make up for that loss in higher selectivity on your mass spec. We see some of these metabolites that are deviate in mass by only 1 Dalton. We see some work from Alnylam recently on deamination products, and how do you differentiate between these? Extremely hard to separate them chromatographically, right? So you do rely on the high resolution to be able to distinguish these species. So I think, especially from a biotransformation perspective, the high resolution from these instruments it's huge, especially when looking at Hillick methods. Play a very important role on that end for sure.
Absolutely agree. High res is really, really useful for this kind of modality as a biologic. So lastly, how about progress and innovation in terms of bioanalytical sample preparation for oligonucleotides, which I feel is maybe a rather overlooked aspect of the whole bioanalytical quantitative workflow, the sample prep and extraction. So especially considering now that there are multiple kit-based SPE options commercially available. Do we see SPE as more of a mainstay rather than adopting, say, a double liquid-liquid extraction workflow?
I mean, I certainly think you're gonna to see people prefer solid phase extraction over liquid-liquid extraction, just because it's so much easier to automate there as well. But I think your point is well taken that the instrument manufacturers have gone to actually developing oligo-specific kits now for people to use, so we're not being forced to adapt and use protein or peptide-based SPE formats like we had to for the longest time there. So that certainly is going to do something for it. I think one of the biggest challenges, at least I see, more as an academic, because these things matter a lot more to me, is that because there aren't as many competitors in the oligo SPE area, the cost for the SPE for oligo plates and SPE cartridges is much higher than other ones. So from my perspective, I would like to see a supply and demand correction there. So we definitely need to get more people into the field for that because it's quite pricey to do SPE of oligos. But I think the other area that I think you're starting to see in sample prep is going to be using capture strands because again, that's an automatable process as well, but it creates some other challenges there because again, the capture strands don't capture as wide a variety of things as the SPE cartridges do. But I also think they may be a little less prone to non-specific adsorptive losses. That's sort of my concern with the whole SPE thing, is that non-specific adsorption in oligos is so much worse than it is in any other type of molecule.
It's true.
And using big surface area sample preparation is going to be problematic, and so you're going to lose something for doing that. And so I do think that potentially looking at the capture strands, because you can get away with not exposing them to as large a surface area, may work. And I think for targeted, it all comes down to what's your interest here. So if you have a very targeted analysis, I think the capture strands are going to work really well. If you need to capture a wider slice of things for like impurity analysis or even total metabolite ID, then solid phase extraction is going to be the way to go there. But once you sort of know what you're looking for, I think the capture strands have a real place here in the sample prep.
Very interesting.
I think Dr. Bartlett nailed it. Hit all the points. It's very dependent on your application, and the only other thing to consider, in my opinion, is that if you go the capture strand route, it's shown that you have less background, right? It's very specific. You're able to wash your sample during preparation and elute in nearly neat solution conditions, as opposed to some of the other ones. They're also clean alternatives as well, but it does seem that there's some literature out there suggesting that the targeted for the targeted hybridization extraction, you do get slightly cleaner samples, although SPE is not far behind, with liquid extraction, of course, being the worst performer out of the three in this aspect. So a couple things to keep in mind for those methods as well.
And certainly liquid extraction for oligos has been around since the dawn of time. And so, there's going to be a lot of people that have used that chloroform phenol extraction for 70 years with oligos. And so, you got to recognize that there are people who have had a lot of experience with it and a lot of success with it, and they're not going to walk away from it very quickly.
Now, I would just like to say, I think we're in an interesting time. It's very exciting to see, your paper coming along a few years back, showing how Hillick methods for oligos do belong in a BA setting, and so I think the field is definitely catching up to the advantages of Hillick. Again, at ASMS, we saw the amount of work being done highlighting Hillick workflows, and so I'm very excited for the new studies to come, new research opportunities on the area.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Hillock is definitely going to have a significant future here in oligos. And it's one of the things that they've got alluded to early on here is it's really, I think, going to be sort of your core facilities and your CDMOs that are supporting the drug development that it's really going to be such a big improvement for. I think the oligotherapeutic companies are less concerned about dedicating instruments to ion pair reverse phase chromatography because they're not analyzing any other type of analytes there. But the CDMOs and your core facilities at universities, they don't have that luxury, and they are not going to play well with the people that want to do ion pair reverse phase on their instruments because they don't have a week to clean their instrument out after they do your experiment there. And so I think you're going to, being able to introduce Hillock methods is going to draw so many more people into the field that I think we're actually held up by the use of ion pair reverse phase because they just didn't want to deal with the challenges in the instrumentation. And I also think it caused a lot more people to stay with ELISA and qPCR methods to do it because they didn't want to move to the LC-MS methods because they didn't want to deal with those kind of challenges. And so I think Hillock is going to have a lot of sort of other downstream effects on the field here as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Bartlett and Dr. Guimaraes. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you in this podcast. And thank you all for listening to this episode of Pharmaron's DMPK Insight series. We would like to remind you that our DMPK webinar series is also available on demand, covering a variety of key questions related to DMPK science in drug discovery and development. Stay tuned for more podcasts in our Pharmaron DMPK Insight series. Thank you, and bye for now.